If I asked you when the last Viking invasion of England was, you might say 1066, when King Harald Hardrada of Norway invaded to claim the English throne and was killed at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. But there were actually 2 further Viking invasions after this. So what happened? This period of history is quite complicated because there's lots of different names and family politics and everyone is distantly related to each other, so I'm going to keep it simple. First, we need a quick recap on the history of Vikings in Britain. In the late 8th century, Viking raiders began attacking coastal communities in Britain and Ireland, most famously the monastery at Lindisfarne in 796, looting the precious gold and carrying away captives as slaves. Over the next century, the Vikings made their way inland, capturing York in 866. They came to control a vast swathe of North and Middle England in a kingdom known as the Danelaw. Throughout the 9th and 10th centuries, there was a bitter, bloody struggle between the Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons until, in the early 11th century, the Viking Canute, or Knut, became king of all England, Denmark and Norway, the North Sea Empire. Let's turn our attention now to a Viking named Sweyn. He was born in England in 1019 and related to 3 of its kings. He was nephew to King Canute and cousin to both King Harthacnut and Harold Godwinson. He was also very distantly related to William the Conqueror. King Canute's wife was William's great-great-aunt. Like I said, the family trees are quite complicated. In 1047, Sweyn became King of Denmark after a struggle with Harald Hardrada, who became King of Norway. When Edward the Confessor, King of England, died in January 1066, there was a succession crisis. There was no clear heir and multiple claimants emerged. Harold Godwinson of England, Harald Hardrada of Norway, and William of Normandy. All were willing to raise armies and fight for the English throne. Sweyn had a good claim, but he didn't have anyone in England willing to back him up. Perhaps he was biding his time, waiting to see what would happen with his neighbour and former rival, Harald Hardrada. But by the end of 1066, Harald Hardrada had been killed at the Battle of Stamford Bridge against Harold Godwinson. Harold Godwinson was then, in turn, killed at the Battle of Hastings by William of Normandy, who, now known as the Conqueror, was crowned King of England on Christmas Day. William knew that Sweyn was a potential rival, but as he hadn't got involved in 1066, he didn't feel the need to make a move against him. All he could really do was ask Sweyn very politely to not get involved in his business. But remember, because King Canute, Sweyn's uncle, had been King of England, Denmark and Norway, it was natural to think that Sweyn would want to restore the North Sea Empire. But before he could worry about that, William had to secure control over his new realm. In January 1069, northern rebels rose up against their new rulers. The rebel leaders appealed to Sweyn for help, whilst William urged him to not get involved. Sweyn did nothing for the time being, and the rebellion was swiftly crushed at York. Sweyn was biding his time. That autumn, he launched a fleet of up to 300 ships towards England. They were commanded by his sons and brother, whilst Sweyn stayed in Denmark. They tried to land at Dover, but were repelled. They tried again at Ipswich and Norwich, and were beaten back both times. Eventually they landed at the Humber. There they were joined by a large rebel force headed by Edgar Atheling, the last male heir of the House of Wessex, great-nephew to Edward the Confessor. He had been too young in 1066 to become king, but now, as a young man, he was ready to take up his claim against the usurper William. The rebels marched on and captured York, defeating the Norman garrison. It was the heaviest loss the Normans suffered in England. Now at this point it's worth mentioning that the Normans themselves were actually Vikings. In the 9th century, Vikings began raiding and then settling in northern France, becoming known as Northmen, Norman. William the Conqueror himself was a descendant of Rollo, who was the first Viking ruler of Normandy. But back to the action. In 1069, revolts ignited across England and Wales. This was a situation which could get rapidly out of control for William. However, the Normans decisively crushed these uprisings, helped in large part by their impressive new castles. Realising that things were not going their way, the Danes decided to execute a favourite Viking gambit: pay us and we'll go away. Throughout the 10th century, when the Viking and Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were in a vicious struggle for survival, desperate English kings tried to pay the Vikings to leave them alone. This backfired because the Vikings realised that they could simply come back and demand more money. I work in the protection business. People pay me to protect them. Protect them from what? From what happens when they don't pay me. You had this cycle of extortion where the Vikings would attack, get paid a tremendous amount of money to leave, and then come back again a few years later. This was known as paying the Danegeld. William paid the Danes to leave, and they agreed to do so in the following year, 1070. Look, me and my boys, we gotta eat, you know. We gotta do a bit of pillaging over the winter. Can't expect us to set sail on an empty stomach. You might think that William was a bit naive in this, but considering he had just spent months putting down rebellions across the country, it was probably an emergency move to buy time while he crushed all remaining resistance. To finally end the rebellions, William began the Harrying of the North, a brutal scorched earth campaign which devastated the North for generations. The scale of destruction could still be seen in the Domesday Book in 1086, with towns and villages listed as barren wastes. To symbolise his stamp of authority over the North, William spent Christmas at York. But the Danes were still in the Humber. They hadn't actually left yet. And in spring 1070, Sweyn himself sailed from Denmark to join the fleet. Ignoring their agreement with William, and come on, you all saw it coming, they sailed to the Wash. Maybe they wanted to invade somewhere unexpected. Maybe they'd caught wind of another rebel leader who could support them. Because there, in the fenlands of Cambridgeshire, they joined the rebel leader Hereward the Wake, who was holding out against the Normans. Together they sacked Peterborough Abbey and generally caused a nuisance, but William soon sent an army to sort them out. It became clear to the Danes that bribery was the most lucrative form of defeat, and once again they agreed to retreat for the right price. William had put down rebellions across the country, and Sweyn had neither the support nor the forces to attempt a full invasion of England. He already had his kingdom of Denmark. He was happy to take the money and go. Hereward and the Fens rebels continued fighting for a few more years, until they, too, were crushed by the end of 1071. Now you might think that that's the end of it, but it wasn't the last Viking invasion, because as late as 1075, William was still putting down rebellions, and the Vikings were still looking for opportunities to invade. The rebellion of the Earls in 1075 was the last major revolt against William in England. William had refused to sanction the marriage of Ralph de Gale, Earl of East Anglia. Ralph got married anyway. He then plotted with 2 other earls to start a rebellion. It went quite badly, and they went to Denmark for help. Sweyn's son, Canute, who had been part of the 1069 invasion, sailed a fleet of 200 ships to Norfolk. But when they arrived, they found that they were too late. The revolt was easily crushed by the Normans. Not wanting to leave empty-handed, the Danes decided to pillage the coast and sacked York one last time before leaving. So was that it? Did the Vikings just give up on their dream of restoring the North Sea Empire? Not quite. Sweyn died in 1076, the last Viking king of Denmark. In 1085, his son Knut, now king, allied with Flanders and Norway and planned an invasion of England. With these new allies, perhaps this time the invasion would succeed. In response, William hired French mercenaries and stationed them across the country. Over the North Sea, a fleet of over 1,000 ships was waiting, but it never set sail. Knut fell victim to political instability. Fearing invasion from the Holy Roman Empire, he kept his fleet waiting. The crews were mostly peasant farmers who needed to take in the harvest back home. They eventually got tired of waiting and complained. The fleet was dispersed, a revolt broke out, and Knut was killed by rebels in 1086. With this, the long shadow of Viking invasion had finally passed. William had triumphed. It might be a coincidence that the Domesday Book, William's bold national survey, was initiated in 1085, the same year as the failed invasion. In 1086, the completed work was presented to him at Old Sarum, where he demanded an oath of allegiance from all his knights and nobles. Perhaps, having fought off 2 foreign invasions and countless domestic rebellions, William wanted to make absolutely sure that his subjects were on his side. And with his new Domesday Book, he knew exactly how much to tax them. As we've seen, when it comes to the story of Vikings in Britain, it doesn't end with 1066. The battle for control of England would rage for another 20 years.